Drug companies love the Orphan Drug Act. They say it encourages research into breakthrough therapies for people with rare diseases. And sometimes that's true. Lots of the time, though, the companies would have pursued the research anyway. And those same companies have learned to game the Orphan Drug Act in a bunch of different ways, allowing them to jack up their prices for no good reason. How could we fix the Orphan Drug Act? That's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. As always, special thanks to Nick Bagley, from whose blog post this series was adapted. In February of 2017, Senator Charles Grassley announced that he was launching a congressional investigation into possible misuses of the orphan drug program and how that might affect drug prices. The European Commission has also commissioned a report on orphan drugs with an eye to changing how they're regulated. So change is in the air! But what might that change look like? If you wanted to go big, you could repeal the Orphan Drug Act outright. Back in 1983, when the act was adopted, drug companies didn't seem to care much about rare diseases. Today, however, prices for orphan drugs have shot through the roof, meaning that drug companies care a lot about them. The normal incentives that encourage drug development, in particular the patent system, might be sufficient to spur the kind of innovation that we want. If that goes too far, though, you could do a lot to make the Orphan Drug Act better targeted and harder to game. First, the 7-year term of regulatory exclusivity could be truncated when revenues exceed any plausible estimate of what it costs to finance R&D into the drug. Otherwise, you're just giving drug companies a big windfall. EU law already allows a reduction of the exclusivity period to 6 years when a drug is deemed sufficiently profitable, although that authority hasn't been exercised yet. The same approach could be adapted here. Second, repurposed drugs shouldn't be eligible for orphan drug exclusivity. After all, the Act was meant to foster research into novel compounds. It wasn't meant to allow a drug company to take a generic drug that's already in widespread use, get it approved as an orphan drug, and then hike up the price. If you want to foster research into new uses of older drugs, we're all for that. But it'd be way cheaper for the government to fund those studies directly than to force thousands of patients to pay gobs and gobs of money for old drugs. Drug companies could pay back government-financed R&D subsidies once drug sales exceed a particular revenue threshold. In Japan, for example, manufacturers must start giving back their R&D subsidies once annual drug sales exceed 100 million yen. We're not talking about chump change. The Orphan Drug Act gives drug manufacturers tax credits amounting to half the cost of their research into orphan drugs. In 2016, those tax credits amounted to about $1.75 billion in foregone tax revenue. By 2020, that figure will be a whopping $3.7 billion, or about $10 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. We should consider having drug companies pay that money back once they've recouped their research expenditures. Any and all of these changes are worth exploring. But here's the thing, even if they're adopted, they won't reduce the prices of most orphan drugs. Why? Because most orphan drugs are also patented, which means they're doubly protected from generic competition. Even if the Orphan Drug Act was wiped from the books, demand for patented orphan drugs will still remain sky high. Until we learn to say no to exorbitant prices, this problem isn't going away. Some countries are slowly learning to say no. Sweden, for example, has declined to pay for about half of newly approved orphan drugs because the prices are too high. If a critical mass of countries followed Sweden's lead, drug manufacturers would come under considerable pressure to cut their prices. Here in the United States, though, it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. We're really, really bad at saying no to orphan drugs for a bunch of different reasons. Keep in mind, first off, that orphan drugs are often developed for conditions for which there are few effective treatment options. Most are first-in-class drugs, meaning that insurance companies won't be able to substitute cheaper therapies. If there's only one drug that can treat your rare condition, insurers are probably going to pay for it. Beyond that, the relatively small number of afflicted patients means that the cost of any one drug, even a very expensive drug, may not put that much strain on an insurer or the healthcare system. The less common the disease, the less hard the payer's going to negotiate over a drug's price. That dynamic may partly explain why orphan drugs tend to get more expensive as the patient population decreases. Finally, those afflicted with an orphan disease are sympathetic and supported by well-organized patient advocacy organizations, including the National Organization for Rare Disorders. An insurer who refuses coverage for a promising new therapy on cost grounds is going to come under a ton of pressure to change its ways. None of this is to say, though, that we shouldn't try to reform the Orphan Drug Act. We should. It's a poorly targeted piece of legislation that imposes huge financial burdens on taxpayers and patients. But our problems are bigger than the Orphan Drug Act. It's just one piece of the healthcare puzzle. Healthcare Triage is supported in part by viewers like you through Patreon.com, a service that allows you to support the show through a monthly donation. Your support makes this show bigger and better. We'd especially like to thank our research associates Joe Sevitz and Jonathan Dunn, and of course our Surgeon Admiral Sam. Thanks, Joe, Jonathan, and Sam. More information can be found at patreon.com/healthcaretriage.